Was Jesus of Nazareth a real historical figure or just a myth? Surprisingly, this question is a relatively modern one. For nearly 1700 years, no one in history, whether it's Christian, Jewish, or pagan, seriously doubted that Jesus existed. Even critics of Christianity, like the Roman philosopher Celsus or the Jewish historian Josephus, never questioned that Jesus was a real person. Instead, they attacked his teachings, his followers, or the claims about his divinity. The idea that Jesus might have been a myth only emerged in the 18th century during the Enlightenment, when some scholars began to question traditional religious beliefs. This led to the so-called Jesus myth theory, claiming that Jesus was a fictional character based on earlier myths about dying and rising gods. But the thing is that this theory isn't supported by any historical evidence. From Roman records to Jewish writings and even early Christian opponents, the evidence consistently points to Jesus being a real figure.
But because we have so many records from so many independent sources, that it's pretty clear he existed. I mean, and one of our sources is in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, who actually knew Jesus' brother. I mean, so, if Jesus didn't exist, you think his brother would know it.
Now, this video is inspired by the works of Bart Ehrman, a leading historian and scholar of early Christianity. Ehrman is not just another voice in the crowd. He is a highly respected academic, someone who has spent decades studying the New Testament and its historical context. And on top of that, he is not a Christian. He is a self-described agnostic. And this is exactly why his work is valuable. So let's get back to the topic now. So every source that mentions Jesus, from the earliest records up until the 18th century, takes his existence for granted. This isn't just true for Christian writers, it applies to Jewish, Roman, and even pagan sources, regardless of whether they were trying to defend, criticize, or simply observe Christianity. The question of whether Jesus existed wasn't even on the table, it was universally assumed. For example, early Christian defenders like Justin Martyr, Tertullian, or Origen spent their time addressing serious accusations against Jesus, including claims that his miracles were magic or that his birth was illegitimate. But not one of their opponents, including the Jewish figure Trypho or the pagan philosopher Celsus, ever argued that Jesus wasn't real. Their criticism focused on his teachings and followers, not his existence. Even Roman historians like Tacitus and Jewish writers like Josephus, who were far from sympathetic to Christianity, reference Jesus as a historical figure. Tacitus, writing around 116 CE, mentions Christus being executed under Pontius Pilate during Tiberius' reign. Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, refers to Jesus and his brother James. These accounts were written independently of the Gospels, and hence this suggests that knowledge of Jesus came from a widely circulated stories of his life. The idea that Jesus was a myth, a purely fictional character, only emerged during the Enlightenment in the 18th century. Before then, no ancient source, whether religious or secular, even hinted at the notion. In fact, scholars across the board, believers and skeptics alike, have pointed out that denying Jesus' existence is more of a modern myth than anything based on history. The evidence from early Christian, Jewish, and Roman texts overwhelmingly points to a real man whose life and teachings left an indelible mark on history. Now let's take a closer look at what scholars believe as two of the most significant non-Christian historians who mention Jesus, and those are Tacitus and Josephus. Tacitus was a Roman historian and senator, widely regarded as one of the greatest historians of ancient Rome. He is best known for his works, Annals and Histories, which provide detailed accounts of the Roman Empire during the 1st century CE. Tacitus was meticulously known for his critical approach and careful use of sources, which makes his writings highly credible. In his Annals, which was written around 116 CE, Tacitus provides an account of the reign of Emperor Nero, particularly focusing on the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. The fire destroyed much of the city, and Nero, facing growing suspicion that he may have been responsible, shifted the blame onto a relatively obscure religious groups at the time, the Christians. Tacitus writes about this event in his Annal, where he mentions Jesus, referred to as Christus, and provides important details about his execution. He writes,
"Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular.
Tacitus wasn't writing about Jesus or Christianity to validate them. He wasn't a supporter of Christianity. In fact, he was openly hostile towards it, referring to Christians as hated for their abominations. His purpose was to document Nero's reign and the fire, and he included information about Christians and their founder because of their relevance to the narrative. His neutral yet critical acknowledgement of Jesus and the rise of Christianity provides strong evidence for the historicity of Jesus, independent of Christian texts. Tacitus' account offers a valuable window into how Jesus and his followers were perceived by outsiders during the early decades of the Christian movement. It also affirms numerous details about Jesus, called Christus, including his historicity, his death under Pontius Pilate, and the persecution of his disciples. Flavius Josephus. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian and military leader who lived during the 1st century CE. Born into a priestly family in Jerusalem, he was well educated and familiar with Jewish law, customs, and traditions. Josephus is best known for his works, The Jewish War and Antiquities of the Jews, which provide detailed accounts of Jewish history, culture, and interactions with the Roman Empire. Josephus' writings are particularly valuable because they offer a unique perspective on the Jewish world during the time of Jesus and the early Christian movement. As a former general in Jewish revolt against Rome, who later allied with the Romans, Josephus had access to both Jewish and Roman sources, which makes his accounts highly detailed and well-informed. Josephus wrote Antiquities of the Jews around 93 to 94 CE, decades after the life of Jesus. His goal was to present Jewish history and culture to a Greco-Roman audience, to showcase the long and rich traditions of the Jewish people. In his work, Josephus makes references to Jesus, which are central to discussions about his historicity. He writes,
"At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders."
The text describes Jesus as a wise man, a teacher, and someone who performed incredible deeds. It even mentions his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate and claims his followers believed he rose from the dead. At first glance, it sounds like a straightforward acknowledgement of Jesus' life. But here is the problem. Parts of the passage sound too Christian, almost like something you would hear from a preacher, not a Jewish historian. For example, it refers to Jesus as the Messiah and says he appeared alive after his death. Josephus was not a Christian, he was a devout Jew, and his writings don't typically endorse Christian beliefs. Most scholars agree that Josephus didn't write the entire passage as we have it today. They believe early Christian scribes who were copying his works added in their own beliefs to make the text sound more favorable toward Jesus. This kind of alteration wasn't uncommon in the ancient world, especially when scribes felt they were clarifying or improving a text to reflect their own views. So while parts of the passage were likely added later, scholars also believe that Josephus did write something about Jesus. Why? Because the core of the passage fits Josephus' style and vocabulary, and it matches with what we know about Jesus from other historical sources. The idea is that Josephus probably described Jesus as a notable figure, but without endorsing the Christian claim that he was the Messiah. Apart from these two authors, there are also numerous other authors that refers to Jesus in their sources. So let's go through a few of them quickly. Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger was a Roman governor of Bithynia who wrote to Emperor Trajan asking for advice on how to deal with the Christians he was persecuting. In Book 10, Letter 96, he describes his procedure to Trajan.
"Others, whose names were given me by an informer, first said that they were Christians and afterwards denied it, declaring that they had been, but were so no longer, some of them having recanted many years before, and more than one so long as 20 years back. They all worshipped your image and the statues of the deities, and cursed the name of Christ. But they declared that the sum of their guilt or their error only amounted to this, that on a stated day, they had been accustomed to meet before daybreak, and to recite a hymn among themselves to Christ, as though he were a god, and that so far from binding themselves by oath to commit any crime, their oath was to abstain from theft, robbery, adultery, and from breach of faith, and not to deny trust money placed in their keeping, when called upon to deliver it.
Marabar Serapion. Marabar Serapion city was destroyed by the Romans who were occupying the land, and he himself was taken captive. From prison, he wrote a letter in Syriac to his son, also called Serapion, encouraging him to pursue wisdom. In it, Marabar Serapion refers to Jesus.
What else can we say? When the wise are forcibly dragged off by tyrants, their wisdom is captured by insults, and their minds are oppressed and without defense. What advantage did the Athenians gain by murdering Socrates, for which they were repaid with famine and pestilence? Or the people of Samos by the burning of Pythagoras, because their country was completely covered in sand in just 1 hour? Or the Jews by killing their wise king, because their kingdom was taken away at that very time? God justly repaid the wisdom of these 3 men. The Athenians died of famine, the Samians were completely overwhelmed by the sea, and the Jews, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, are scattered through every nation. Socrates is not dead because of Plato, neither is Pythagoras because of the statue of Juno, nor is the wise king because of the new laws he laid down.
While Jesus is not explicitly named, it is almost certain that Marabar Serapion is referring to Jesus as the wise king, whom the Jews killed. Remember that the title King of the Jews was one used by Pilate, Roman soldiers, and even some Jews themselves. Lucian of Samosata. Lucian of Samosata was a famous Greek satirist who also referred to Jesus in his work, The Death of Peregrine, which was written sometime after AD 165. In it, he mocks Christians, writing,
"The Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites, and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion, which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws."
In this statement from the middle of the 2nd century, we see Lucian acknowledge the following historical facts. Jesus was founder of a religion who was crucified. His followers were converted and considered themselves spiritual brothers and sisters. Jesus' followers worshipped him as God. Suetonius, a Roman historian, wrote a famous book called De Vita Caesarum, Lives of the Caesars. This book shares the stories of the first 12 Roman rulers, starting from Julius Caesar and ending with Emperor Domitian. In the section about Emperor Claudius, who ruled from AD 41 to 54, Suetonius mentioned why Claudius decided to expel the Jews from Rome. This event is also mentioned in the Bible in Acts chapter 18 verse 2.
Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome.
Most scholars, regardless of their beliefs, agree that Christus is probably a misspelling of Christus, the Latin word for Jesus Christ. In fact, early Christian leaders often used the name Christus or Christos and even called themselves Christians. This reference by Suetonius shows that within a century of Jesus' life, people knew he existed and recognized him as a significant and controversial figure who caused unrest among Jews during Claudius' reign. This aligns with what the Bible says. So these were some of the most notable references to Jesus from outside the Bible. And of course there are many other places where he is mentioned, but I think this would be enough. And again, one of the often overlooked sources that testify to his historicity comes from early Christian writers who lived around the same time as Tacitus. These writers didn't simply repeat the gospel. In fact, they provide independent information about Jesus, and some even reported what they heard directly from people who knew him. Their letters and treatises record details about his life, his death, and most importantly, their belief that he rose from the dead. For example, figures like Ignatius of Antioch, Clement of Rome, and Polycarp offer significant insights. These leaders of early churches were not writing to invent Jesus, they were addressing practical and theological issues within Christian communities, often referencing Jesus as a known and central figure. Their writings reflect widespread knowledge of Jesus, showing that his life and teachings were deeply ingrained in the collective memory of early Christians. What makes these sources particularly valuable is their proximity to the events they describe. These authors were active within a generation or two of Jesus' life, at a time when people who had met him or witnessed the early Christian movement were still alive. Their writings are independent attestations to Jesus' existence, providing a perspective that isn't entirely reliant on the Gospels. So this rapid rise of Christianity, coupled with the writings of early Christians like Ignatius, Clement, and Polycarp, points to something undeniable. That is, Jesus wasn't just an idea or a legend. He was a real person whose life and impact were so profound that they sparked a movement that forever changed the history. I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you did so, then please like this video and subscribe to this channel for more of such videos. And thanks for watching.